All right, in this chapter, we are going to talk about uh, environmental and applied microbiology. This is more specifically the ecology and biotechnology of microbes. Um, First of all, we will just look at what microbial ecology means, and then we're going to look at symbiotic relationships involving microorganisms and us. We're going to look at the indigenous microorganisms that live on our bodies normally, the good roles, the bad roles that these microbiota may have. We will talk about biofilms, and then we'll hit a little bit on agricultural microbiology and biotechnology. So ecology basically is just the study of the relationship between living organisms. So in microbial ecology, we're going to look at how different microbes living and interacting with each other affect each other. And then we're also going to look at how the interactions of microbes and us works. So most microbes that we come into contact with are either beneficial or really make no difference in our lives. It's only a small percentage of them, less than 1% of the microbes that we come into contact with that we would consider pathogenic or harmful. Most microorganisms that we are exposed to are either in or on our bodies, and we call those the indigenous microbiota, or a more common but older term would be normal flora. Now, two dissimilar organisms living together in association with each other, so they're having an effect on each other, this would be known as symbiosis. And the organisms in the relationship are symbionts. So microorganisms between themselves have many, many symbiotic relationships, as well as the microbes that are on our bodies or in our bodies, and us having symbiotic relationships. Neutralism basically means neither of the symbionts is affected by the relationship. You're both there. You don't help each other, but you don't hurt each other. Communalism is a symbiotic relationship where it's beneficial to one and of no consequence to the other. So most of the microbes living on us gain a benefit of a place to live and some protection and maybe even some nutrients but they don't harm us. Mutualism, on the other hand, means that both parties benefit from this relationship. The algae and the fungus that live in a lichen help each other because the fungus produces nutrients that the algae produces nutrients that the fungus needs, and the fungus provides nutrients for the algae to do their thing and also a protective place to stay. In humans, a lot of the bacteria that live in us provide benefits for us, and we obviously provide benefits for them, like E. coli. Certain versions of E. coli and certain versions of other bacteria in our guts will make nutrients and vitamins for us or help us digest food that we can't digest ourselves. And we obviously provide them a source of nutrients and a place to live. In parasitism, this relationship is benefit to one and harms the other. So the host is damaged by the parasite. So a host is a living organism that harbors another one. A parasite will always do harm to the host. Now, this may be harm as far as a disease or just an annoyance. A change in conditions can actually change the type of symbiotic relationship two microorganisms have as well. So you could have something that is mutualistic or something that is communalistic on you and really having no effect or a positive effect suddenly have a negative effect if the environment shifts. So here you can see lichen in a mutualistic relationship where the algae and the fungi both benefit from each other's presence. Most mites in human hair don't really harm the humans, but they get a benefit from the hair and the skin around them. So they would be communalists. And then the sleeping sickness parasite, Trypanosoma gambiense, this is a parasite. It causes a disease in us. We give it all sorts of benefits, and it gives us lots of harm. Here's a picture of lichens on rock. Now, the indigenous microbes that we have on our bodies, bacteria, fungus, viruses, protozoans, all sorts of things, make up our little microbiome. There are about up to 1,000 different species of microbes that live on and in our bodies. There are more microbes alive in and on you than there are people on the planet, just to put things in perspective. Now, blood, lymph, cerebrospinal fluid should be free of microbes. They should be sterile. Transient microbiota take up residence on or within humans and then leave. They don't stay there. Now, if you damage or injure one resident microbe, it can change the balance of the microbes that are already there. So in one case, it could, if you wipe out the normal bacteria that lives in your gut, or say in the case of a woman taking antibiotics, the vaginal flora will be disturbed because most of the bacteria that will live there will go away. And now the fungus that's there actually has a chance to grow more and grow out of control. And this is why it's very, very common for women who take antibiotics to have a yeast infection a few days later. So areas of the body where most of the indigenous microbes live: your skin would be a huge part. Your GI tract would probably be the biggest one. Mouth and upper respiratory tract, eyes, ears, and then the genital urinary tract, specifically the vagina, to a lesser degree the urethra. Now the skin microbes, mostly bacteria and a little bit of fungus. There are all sorts of them, but the most common groups belong to the Staphylococcus species. So things like Staphylococcus aureus, Staphylococcus epidermis, that live on your skin all the time. Now, how many there are and which versions there are depend on a number of things. And if you go back to the chapter we were looking at last time, this should make sense. How much moisture is there? What's the pH? What's the temperature? How much salt is there? What other chemicals and waste products and things like that are there? Those will all determine the makeup of the microbes of your body, specifically your skin. Now, in the eyes and in the ears, you're talking about the outer parts. The outer ear is the only place where you should find microbes. The middle ear and inner ear should be relatively sterile. The inner ear should be completely sterile. They would be the same microbes you'd find on your skin. The eye is lubricated by tears and mucus and sebum, which washes away most of the microbes, plus the chemicals in tears will actually lyse and destroy most microbes. So there shouldn't be many there. The respiratory tract will have lots of different types of microbes, and they will vary from region to region. So the upper respiratory tract, which is basically your nose and your throat, and the lower respiratory tract, everything from the larynx on down, will have very, very different microbes. And the upper respiratory tract will have a much larger variety of them, and in most people will not do any harm. So in the upper respiratory tract, the microbes that you see up there are not typically going to cause you problems, but some of them are what we call opportunistic pathogens. Something that in most cases won't cause you any problems, but when enough changes to the environment happen, they become pathogenic. Carriers are people who have a virulent pathogen somewhere in their body, usually in their mouth or nose or in their throat, and they don't have the disease, but because they're carrying the microbe that causes it, they can spread it to other people. A number of diseases, diphtheria, pneumonia, meningitis, whooping cough, these are all things that you can have the microbe that causes the disease, but if your immune system is strong enough, you won't get the disease. But if it's not already recognizing these diseases, it won't kill them off. The lower respiratory tract should be free of microbes. Most of the time when it becomes infected, it's things that were actually infecting the upper respiratory tract. Now, one example, by the way, of this carrier's idea, some of you may have heard of a woman named Typhoid Mary. She was a woman who never developed typhoid or typhoid fever, but she spread it to hundreds and hundreds of people. She was a carrier. She carried the bacteria that caused this disease, but never got the sickness herself. Microbes of the oral cavity. Oral cavity affords a shelter for a whole bunch of anaerobic and aerobic bacteria. So the stuff that's in your mouth is going to typically be aerobic. As it gets back farther and farther into the throat, it's going to become microaerophilic or anaerobic. These microbes actually feed off of the food particles that are left in your mouth. And because you may leave these, especially if you don't brush and floss regularly, you can get cavities from this. And the cavities are not from eating sweet food and it's the sugar that eats away at your teeth. It's that the sugar that you left in your mouth or the food that you left in your mouth feeds a microbe, and that microbe releases acids which destroy the teeth. Gingivitis is gum disease, which will often be exaggerated or exacerbated by microbes. And periodontitis is when that goes crazy and you have inflammation of all of your gums. The most common organisms with the indigenous microbiota of the mouth are a whole bunch of different types of hemolytic streptococcal bacteria. The microbes of the gut, the GI tract, they vary quite a bit, and there's a whole bunch of different species. The GI tract is where we digest our food, absorb the nutrients, and get rid of the stuff we don't need. And in the colon, you're going to see colonies, many colonies, hundreds of them, of bacteria that are actually breaking down the food into many smaller pieces. The colon is anaerobic, so bacteria in the colon are mostly obligate anaerobes, or they're facultative anaerobes. A handful of them are aerotolerant, which means they don't use the oxygen, but it doesn't kill them. The members of the colon's microbes tend to be opportunists. If there are too many of them, they will cause diseases. But if they are kept in check by all the others, they won't. The microbes of the genitourinary tract, these should not be very common, but there are a handful that we do tend to see a lot of. The genitourinary tract is the kidneys, the ureters, the urinary bladder, the urethra, and the parts of the male or female reproductive system that are attached to it, are connected to it. So the kidneys, the ureters, the urinary bladder are usually sterile. Distal urethra and its opening might have microbes, bacteria, yeast, viruses. Most frequent causes of urethral infections. The most common cause of urinary tract infections in females is E. coli bacteria, which came from the anus, where it naturally belongs, through the vagina into the urethra. Numbers 2 and 3 in females and numbers 1 and 2 in males are chlamydia, trachomatis, and Neisseria gonorrhea, the things that cause chlamydia and gonorrhea. The female and male reproductive systems should be sterile except for the vagina, which usually has a whole host of bacteria and fungus in it. Now, we get a whole bunch of benefits from these microbes. The microbes in your intestines will actually make, among other things, vitamins K and B12. So they're providing you vitamins. Many other microbes will digest foods that we can't digest and actually make some of the nutrients in those foods available to us for the first time. Now, because there are so many different microbes in a given environment, you will start to see what's called microbial antagonism, where the presence of one inhibits the growth of the other. So many members of our indigenous microbiota, our normal flora, are beneficial because, for no other reason, they prevent other microbes that would make us sick from taking up residence. Now, other examples of microbial antagonism involve some bacteria or microbes that actually produce toxins to the others. And E. coli is a perfect example. It provides or produces this thing called colicin, which actually kills a whole bunch of other gram-negative bacteria so that it can kind of run its own show. Now, an opportunistic pathogen is a microbe that hangs around, doesn't really cause problems most of the time, but when the opportunity is right, it will cause an infection. So opportunistic pathogens and biotherapeutic agents. The opportunistic pathogens we talked about were the ones that like to hang around, that cause infection only when the opportunities are exactly right, the environment has changed. E. coli, which is in your gut, most of the time causes no problems, but it can cause serious gut infections. Staph aureus exists on your skin all the time. And many of you even have a version of MRSA on your skin, but it's not making you sick. It will become a problem if the right environment happens, if the right circumstances happen. So the delicate balance that these normal flora have can be upset by any sort of drug treatment or therapy that alters their environment. Antibiotics will wipe out the bacteria, but leave the viruses, the fungi, and the other things present to cause problems, and they will typically grow out of control. Bacteria and yeasts used to stabilize the microbial balance are called biotherapeutic agents or probiotics. So many of you either know of or have recommended to people to take bacteria, certain microbes, ingest them as part of your gut health. And in fact, one of the reasons yogurt is such a good food for you is because the bacteria in there acts as a probiotic. Now, it's rare to find any sort of ecological niche where there's only one type of organism, much less one type of microbe, causing the effect. That would be like saying you have a place where there are millions of trees, but they're all exactly the same tree. And no birds, no insects, no anything living in or among them. Microbes are often organized into what we call biofilms, communities where there's a whole bunch of different organisms, different species that are interacting together, and the group, the ecosystem they create, actually behaves differently than any of the individual microbes might. So you're going to find these everywhere. The plaque on your teeth is made up of biofilms. You can find this in medical equipment that hasn't been cleaned well. You can find biofilms on the bottom of rocks. Basically, these are a whole bunch of different species of mostly bacteria, and the different, remember we talked about them making a glycocalyx, which they secreted, this sugary mix of stuff that they secrete that could either become a capsule or could be just something to help them stick to other things. Well, in this case, those polysaccharides they secrete have tunnels in them that allow the bacteria to communicate with each other and create environments where a chemical that one bacteria makes can mix with a chemical that another one makes and now have a completely new third chemical that has a very different behavior. Now, biofilms have a huge medical significance because they can cause diseases in catheters, in other places. People who don't brush their teeth regularly may see some of the microbes in their plaque, their dental plaque, get into their throat, get into their blood system somehow or other and cause other problems like endocarditis, heart problems. Microbes commonly associated with biofilms and medical devices include Candida albicans, which is a yeast, bacteria like Staph aureus, or a whole bunch of enterococcal species, gut bacteria, Klebsiella pneumonia, which is commonly found in people's upper respiratory tracts and causing no problem, or Pseudomonas aeruginosa, which, well, if that's in your respiratory system, it's probably causing a problem. Biofilms are very resistant to antibiotics and disinfectants because you have a whole bunch of different microbes, each of them secreting things that may protect the whole group, the whole colonies, from the different antibiotics or disinfectants. An antibiotic that works on one specific microorganism might not be effective against it in a biofilm. Bacteria and biofilms will produce different proteins than the bacteria will by themselves. So here's an electron microscope of Staph aureus biofilm. Synergistic infections. So when two microorganisms, neither of which would cause a major problem, mix together, now you have what's called a synergistic infection. The outcome of the two of them combining is greater than the sum of both of the parts would be. Another name you may hear for this, and you actually will commonly hear, is polymicrobial infection. Acute necrotizing ulcerative gingivitis, or what some people will call trench mouth, is an example of a synergistic infection, and certain versions of bacterial vaginosis would also be synergistic infections. Now, in agriculture, there are plenty of microbes used. Some of this is in genetic engineering, some of this just happens because of nature. The bacteria found within other microorganisms are called endosymbionts, especially if they're growing in the guts of other things. Now, microorganisms play an important role in chemical cycling. So getting carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, sulfur, phosphorus out of dead and decaying matter or out of feces into new growing plants. Nitrogen is converted by nitrogen-fixing bacteria and cyanobacteria into usable chemicals like ammonia and ammonium. So here you go. I don't know why they picked an armadillo, but a dead armadillo dies, and some of the bacteria in here will help break the nitrogen out of its proteins and put it back into the soil. And now the new plant growing can actually benefit from this and make something new. The role of microbes in an elemental cycle, like I just said, a whole bunch of nitrogen fixing and denitrifying bacteria are involved in the decay of these microorganisms. Nitrifying bacteria include a whole bunch of stuff. We won't memorize the names. Now, root nodules, so growing on the root are different types of fungus and bacteria that will grow here that will actually help the root of the plant absorb nutrients that the whole plant can use. Within the soil, you're also going to find a huge variety of bacteria, fungus, algae, protozoans, viruses, and other decomposers. A variety of human pathogens live in the soil. Clostridium tetani, which causes tetanus, Clostridium botulinum, which causes botulism, And Bacillus anthracis, which you guessed it, causes anthrax. The types and amounts of microbes living in the soil depend on a whole bunch of factors. What stuff is there that's decaying, providing nutrients? That is a huge factor. What's the moisture level and the oxygen level and the pH and the temperature and the presence of all these other things, the waste products of other microbes and other dying organisms? Now, diseases of farm animals are caused by a whole bunch of pathogens. Many of them can be passed on to humans. These are things that farmers and ranchers will worry about, and humans should worry about, because if you can pass a bacterial infection from a cow to a human, anyone who comes into contact with those cows could be passing an infection onto the humans. Microbial diseases of plants, these are less worrisome, but they're still worrisome because, well, they cause plants to die, and we need plants to make food, to make shelter, to do all sorts of stuff. Most plant diseases are caused by fungus, viruses, viroids, or bacteria. Biotechnology is any technological application that uses biological systems, living organisms, or derivatives of them to make or modify products or processes for a specific use. Here's the deal. We use microbes to do all sorts of things. We produce foods and beverages with them. Again, you wouldn't have beer, wine, bread without yeast, which is a fungus. We use bacteria, certain bacteria, to make cheese. We use bacteria and viruses to make vaccines and antibiotics and things like that. Fungus to make antibiotics. Microbes are used to make bread, cheese, olives, pickles, vinegar, yogurt, beer and wine, all sorts of stuff that you come into contact with regularly. Antibiotics are produced by fungi and bacteria. And by the way, we use certain bacteria to make other things like insulin and like human growth hormone. Bioremediation is the use of microbes to clean up wastes, chemical spills, toxic things. When the Deepwater Horizon oil platform exploded a number of years ago in the Gulf of Mexico, one of the most effective ways to clean this up was to introduce a whole bunch of bacteria who would only eat oil. As long as there was oil to be eaten, they would grow and they would divide and make more and more bacteria to eat the oil. And then as soon as the oil was gone, well, the bacteria started to die off. Methanotrophs, bacteria that usually consume methane in the environment. So again, if you have a whole bunch of chemicals that may be seeping methane or other things that could be dangerous to us, you may want to actually use these bacteria to help bioremediate, bring the soil back to healthy, normal.